I was replacing the weather stripping on the back door when my phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from my son. 3 words. We need to talk. I set down the utility knife and wiped my hands on my jeans. 23 years of raising that boy, and those 4 words still made something tighten in my chest. Not fear exactly, more like the feeling you get when you see dark clouds moving in from the west, and you've got laundry on the line. His name is Owen. He was 31 that autumn, working as a project coordinator for a civil engineering firm in Mississauga. A good job, steady. He'd gotten it mostly on his own merit, which is the part that always made me proudest. I'm Gerald. Retired now, I spent 34 years as a claims adjuster for a mid-sized insurance company in Hamilton, Ontario. Not glamorous work, but it taught me one thing better than any university course ever could. People lie, and the lies almost always follow a pattern. Owen had been with his girlfriend for about 14 months when he texted me that morning. Her name was Simone. I'd met her 4 times, twice for dinner at my place. Once at a work event Owen brought her to, and once at a Christmas gathering at his aunt's house. She was charming in the way that well-rehearsed people are charming. She always remembered what you'd said the last time you spoke, asked follow-up questions, laughed at the right moments. My late wife, Patricia, used to say that real warmth was spontaneous. It spilled out accidentally. It didn't arrive on cue. Patricia passed 6 years ago. Breast cancer. 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Owen was the one who drove her to chemo every Thursday because I couldn't hold myself together enough to do it. He's a better man than me in a lot of ways, which is exactly why it broke something in me to watch what was about to happen to him. I texted back, "Come for dinner Saturday. I'll make the chili you like." He came. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of tea, and he told me he was going to propose to Simone. He'd already bought the ring. He showed me a photo on his phone, a simple oval solitaire, white gold. Patricia would have said it was elegant. I said it was beautiful, because it was, and because he needed to hear that from me first, before anything else. Then I asked him a question I'd been holding for a while. I asked him what he knew about her family, her finances, her history before they met. Not as an interrogation. I framed it the way I'd learned to frame things in 34 years of adjusting claims. Conversationally, like I was just curious. He told me she'd grown up in the Okanagan, that her parents had split when she was young, that she'd done 2 years of college before moving to Ontario for work. She'd had a relationship before him that ended badly. She didn't talk about it much. She was between jobs when they met, but had since picked up contract work in event coordination. I nodded and ate my chili and didn't say anything more about it that night. But I didn't sleep well. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I did not dislike Simone from the start. Dislike is an emotion. What I felt around her was closer to a professional instinct, the same low hum in the back of my mind I used to get when I read a claim that was technically consistent, but somehow too consistent. Every detail fitting too neatly. No rough edges. In claims work, rough edges are normal. Life is messy. When a story is perfectly smooth, that's when you start reading it more carefully. The thing that started it wasn't anything dramatic. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Owen's dinner. I was at the Fortinos near my house picking up a few things, and I saw Simone in the parking lot. She was standing beside a dark blue SUV I didn't recognize, talking to a man. I wouldn't have thought anything of it. I don't own my son's girlfriend except for 2 things. One was the way she touched his arm when she laughed. Not friendly, familiar. The second was that when she turned and saw me, the laugh stopped like a switch had been flipped, and she smiled instead, the polished version, and said, "Gerald, what are you doing all the way over here? My house is 4 blocks away. I go to that Fortinos every week." I said I was just grabbing a few things and asked if she'd like to join me for a coffee at the Tim's next door. She said she had somewhere to be. The man in the parking lot had already gotten into the SUV and was looking at his phone. I drove home. I put away the groceries. I sat in Patricia's old reading chair by the window, and I thought for a long time. I am not a man who acts on instinct alone. That's how people make mistakes they can't take back. What I do, what I was trained to do, is document. Observe and document. And let the facts tell you what the feeling is actually pointing at. I want to be honest with you. What I'm about to describe doesn't make me a hero. It makes me a worried father who used the only tools he actually knew how to use. I started by looking at what was publicly available: Facebook, LinkedIn, the provincial court records database that anyone in Ontario can access. I searched her full name, Simone Vasiliev, and I searched the name she'd mentioned once in passing as a previous name from a brief marriage years ago. The LinkedIn was sparse. A few contract positions, nothing long-term, nothing going back more than 4 years in Ontario. The Facebook was private, but showed a profile picture and a header photo that told me she owned a dog and liked hiking, and had once stood on what looked like a boat dock somewhere with mountains behind her. The court records were more interesting. There was a civil matter from about 5 years ago. A former partner, a man named Douglas Price, had filed a civil claim against her for fraudulent misrepresentation related to a joint financial agreement. The claim had been settled out of court. The terms were sealed, but the existence of the filing was public. I printed it out and put it in a folder in my filing cabinet, between the hydro bills and the property tax records, which is where I keep things I need but don't want to look at every day. I didn't tell Owen. Not yet. I knew how it would land. He'd been with her 14 months. He'd bought the ring. If I walked in at that moment with a printed court record and told him his girlfriend had been civilly sued for fraud by a previous partner, I knew exactly what would happen. He'd tell Simone would have an explanation, and I would become the suspicious, overprotective father who couldn't accept that his son had moved on after losing his mother. That's not a guess. That's pattern recognition. So I waited, and I kept my eyes open. The man from the parking lot appeared again 6 weeks later. I know, because Owen mentioned, without any apparent concern, that Simone had a childhood friend visiting from out of province, and she'd been spending a fair amount of time with him, helping him get settled. A childhood friend, from the Okanagan. I asked what his name was. Owen didn't know. I asked if he'd met him. He hadn't. I went back to the court filing and looked at the name of the person listed as co-respondent. The other person named in the civil matter alongside Douglas Price. The name was Marcus Holt. I typed Marcus Holt into a basic search. One of the first results was a Facebook profile with a dark blue SUV in the cover photo. I sat with that for a long time. Owen proposed to Simone on a Saturday in November. She said yes. He called me that same afternoon, voice full of something I hadn't heard in years, pure, uncomplicated happiness. I told him I was glad. I told him she was lucky to have him. I meant the second part completely. The engagement party was scheduled for February, at the home of Simone's friend in Oakville. I was invited. I planned to go. But about 3 days before the party, I made a decision. I hired someone. His name is Bernard, and he is not a private investigator in the dramatic sense. He's a retired fraud examiner who does consulting work on the side, and who I've known peripherally for about 15 years through industry connections. I called him, explained what I had: the court record, the parking lot incident. The connection between Simone and the man I suspected was Marcus Holt, and I asked him if he could find out more before I either acted or stayed quiet and watched my son make the worst mistake of his life. Bernard said he'd need a few weeks and a modest retainer. I transferred the money the next morning. The engagement party came and went. Simone was radiant. She hugged me at the door and told me she'd always hoped Owen's father would be someone she could count on. I smiled and said, I hoped the same thing. We ate small plates of things I couldn't name, and I watched Marcus Holt standing near the kitchen talking to a woman I'd never seen before, laughing too loudly, touching people's arms in that same familiar way. He didn't know who I was. That was important. I left at 9:30 and drove home in the dark, and didn't think about anything except the road. Bernard came back to me on a Thursday in early March. We met at a Tim Hortons in Stony Creek, which feels almost too Canadian to say out loud, but that's where we met. He brought a manila envelope and a plain black notebook, and he ordered a large double-double, and he laid everything out in front of me, the way a doctor lays out imaging results, matter-of-factly, because the facts are the facts, regardless of how they feel. What Bernard had found, working through financial records, cross-referencing addresses, and speaking to one person who'd known Douglas Price and was willing to talk, painted a picture I'd been half hoping was wrong. Simone and Marcus had a documented history going back at least 9 years. They were not childhood friends. They had been, at various points in a relationship, in a business arrangement, and in legal trouble together. The civil suit from Douglas Price alleged that Simone had entered into a cohabitation and financial partnership agreement with him, while maintaining a separate relationship with Marcus, and that Marcus had benefited financially from the arrangement through Simone. Douglas Price was a man of some modest means, a small business owner, not wealthy but comfortable. The civil claim alleged that over the course of their 2-year relationship, Simone had gradually become a joint holder on 2 of his accounts, that significant funds had been transferred to a third account that Price had no knowledge of, and that when the relationship ended, he found himself with considerably less than he'd started with. The claim was settled. Price received some portion of the money back. The rest, Bernard believed, had moved through several accounts and was likely long gone. My son's mother had left him a house, a paid-off, 3-bedroom semi in Ancaster, worth somewhere north of $800,000 in the current market. She'd put it in Owen's name before she died. He'd lived in it for 2 years after her passing, and then rented it out when he moved closer to work. It was sitting there, generating income, fully in his name. I drove home from Stony Creek, and I sat in the car in my driveway for probably 20 minutes before I went inside. Then I called a lawyer. Her name is Renata, and she does family and estate law out of an office in downtown Hamilton. I'd used her years ago to update my own will after Patricia died. I explained the situation, and she explained my options, which were, essentially, that I had no legal standing to stop my adult son from doing anything, but that there were things I could encourage him to do to protect himself, and there were things I could do to protect my own estate, which was the other issue I hadn't mentioned yet. Owen was my sole beneficiary. Everything I had, the house, the RRSPs, the modest investment account I'd built up over 30 years of brown bag lunches and sensible cars, was going to him when I died. If he married Simone and something happened to me while they were married, she would be positioned in a way that turned my stomach. Renata helped me restructure. We put certain assets into a trust with specific conditions. We updated beneficiary designations. We made sure that in the event of my death, what I'd built couldn't be redirected through a marriage I'd never sanctioned. That took 2 appointments and about 3 weeks. Then I had to figure out what to do about Owen. The wedding was set for late August. They'd booked a venue in Niagara-on-the-Lake, one of those converted vineyard properties with a long laneway and white lights in the trees. 64 guests, catering already paid for, flowers ordered. Owen was happy in that quiet, focused way he got when he'd made a decision and felt good about it. Every time I saw him that spring, I turned the conversation over and over in my mind, looking for the right entry point. There was none. Any point was the wrong point. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't tell him the same way I'd imagined telling him, sitting him down, handing him the folder, watching his face, because that approach handed Simone all the time in the world to construct a counter-narrative. In claims work, you don't present your findings to the subject of the investigation first. You present them in a context where the evidence speaks before the subject gets a chance to reframe it. I had to be patient for a little longer. The wedding was on a Saturday. The rehearsal dinner was Friday evening at the venue, and I was invited. And I went, and I watched Simone move through the room with that practiced warmth, touching elbows, remembering names, tilting her head when she listened, and I watched my son look at her the way a person looks at something they've decided is permanent. Marcus was there, listed in the program as a friend of the bride. He and I sat at adjacent tables during dinner. I introduced myself as Owen's father. He said he'd heard a lot about me. I said I'd heard a little about him. He smiled in a way that suggested he thought I was harmless. I'm 63 years old. I drive a sensible car. I wear sensible shoes. I have reading glasses on a cord around my neck. I am, in every visible way, harmless. Saturday arrived. The ceremony was outdoors, which, in late August in Niagara, means either beautiful or miserable. And that day, it was beautiful, warm, and dry, with a light breeze off the lake, and the kind of late afternoon light that turns everything gold. I sat in the second row on the groom's side, and I watched my son stand at the end of the laneway and wait. And he looked so much like his mother in that moment that I had to look at the program for a minute instead of him. Simone came down the laneway on the arm of a man I didn't know, and she was lovely, genuinely lovely, and for about 30 seconds, I felt the particular grief of knowing that the most painful things in life are usually also beautiful. The ceremony was short. The officiant was a friend of theirs who'd gotten ordained online. He said the usual things and added a few personal touches that made people laugh softly and lean toward each other. When it was over, when the officiant said the words, and Owen kissed her, and the guests applauded, I stood and clapped with everyone else. The reception was in the barn that had been converted into an event space. Round tables with candles, a small band setting up near the far wall, a bar along one side. I found my seat table 4, near the back, which I suspected was not an accident, and I said hello to the people around me and poured myself a glass of water. About 45 minutes into the reception, after the first dances and before the speeches, Simone found me. She sat down in the empty chair beside me and leaned in and said, very pleasantly and very quietly, that she and Owen had talked and they both felt it might be better if I slipped out early. She said she knew it was hard for me adjusting to this, letting go. She said she wanted us to have a real relationship eventually, but that tonight needed to be theirs, and she thought I'd understand. I looked at her. She held the smile. I said, of course. I'll say goodnight to Owen and be on my way. She looked slightly surprised that there was no resistance. She reached over and patted my hand. Thank you, Gerald. This means a lot. I found Owen near the bar. I told him I was heading out, that it was a long drive home and these old knees weren't what they used to be, and I wanted to say goodnight properly before the evening got away from us. He hugged me and said he was glad I was there. I held on for a second longer than usual. Then I said, before I go, there's someone I'd like you to meet, an old friend of mine who was in the area. He came to see me yesterday, and I mentioned the wedding. I hope you don't mind, I asked him to stop in for just a few minutes. Owen looked confused but agreeable. He said, of course. I walked to the entrance of the barn, and I made a phone call. 2 minutes later, Douglas Price walked in. He was in his mid-50s, stocky, with a salt and pepper beard and the careful, measured way of moving that I've noticed in people who've been through something and come out the other side with their dignity intact, but their trust permanently recalibrated. I'd found him through Bernard. I'd called him myself 6 weeks earlier. I'd explained who I was and what my son was about to do. I'd told him I wasn't asking him to do anything he wasn't willing to do. I'd told him he could say no and I would never contact him again. He'd said he'd think about it. He called me back 4 days later and said yes. I brought him to Owen and I said, Owen, I want you to meet Douglas. Douglas, this is my son. They shook hands. Owen still looked confused. I said, Douglas has something he'd like to share with you. I'll give you some privacy. I stepped back. I watched from a distance. I watched Owen's expression move through confusion into attention, into something I can only describe as the face a person makes when the ground shifts unexpectedly under their feet. At some point, Marcus appeared near the table. He looked at Douglas. Something passed across his face. I don't know exactly what Douglas said. We'd agreed that it was his story to tell, and that he would tell it however he chose to tell it. What I know is that he spoke to Owen for about 12 minutes, and at the end of those 12 minutes, Owen was standing very still, with his hands at his sides, and his wedding boutonniere slightly askew. Then Owen looked across the room and found Simone. She had noticed. Of course, she had noticed. She was already moving toward them, the smile already assembled, the explanation already loading. I could see it from where I stood. What I hadn't expected was what Owen did. He held up his hand, one hand flat in her direction. Stop. She stopped. He said something to her. I was too far away to hear it. Whatever he said, she shook her head and reached for his arm, and he stepped back, just slightly, just one step, and that step was the clearest thing I'd ever seen him do in his life. The band was playing. People were dancing. The candles were lit. It was still beautiful. Outside, the light off the lake had gone from gold to blue. I don't want to make this into something tidy, because it wasn't. What followed was not a movie ending. There was no scene where Simone confessed or broke down, or Marcus fled dramatically into the Niagara night. What there was was a wedding reception that quietly shifted in mood as word moved through the room the way it always does in pieces, through expressions, through whispered exchanges near the bar. Some guests didn't understand what was happening. Some guests left early. The band played through to 10 o'clock because they'd been paid to. Simone and Owen did not leave together. I drove back to Hamilton that night, and I sat in the reading chair by the window for a long time. The house was quiet. It's been quiet for 6 years, but that night the quiet felt different. Not empty. Exactly. More like the particular silence of a decision that's been made and can't be unmade. Owen called me the next morning. He asked me to come over. I drove to Mississauga, and I sat across from him at his kitchen table. The same kitchen table. Different chairs, and he looked tired in the way that people look tired when they haven't slept, because they've been doing the hard work of revising everything they thought they knew. He asked me how long I'd known. I told him the truth. I'd had a suspicion for a while, but I hadn't known. Not really, until Bernard found the details. He asked me why I hadn't told him sooner. I said, because if I'd told you sooner, she'd have had time to write the next chapter before you'd finished reading the first one. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, Douglas told me about the accounts, about the way it happened, slowly, and then all at once. He looked at his hands. I kept thinking about the joint account she'd suggested we open. For household expenses, we were supposed to set it up next month. I didn't say anything, he said. She knew about Mom's house, Dad. She asked me about it on our second date. I thought she was just curious about my life. The joint account he mentioned was one thing, but what he told me next was something Bernard hadn't found, something I hadn't known to look for. Owen had received an email 3 weeks before the wedding. From a financial advisor, Simone had recommended a man named Robert, supposedly a specialist in optimizing rental income. The email suggested that the most tax-efficient structure for Owen's rental property would be to transfer it into a joint holding. The email had been warm and professional and had included a referral from Simone. Owen had been about to respond. He'd drafted the reply twice. He just hadn't sent it yet. He showed me the email on his laptop. The advisor's firm, when I looked it up, had been incorporated 8 months ago. The registered director shared an address with Marcus Holt. I closed the laptop gently, and I looked at my son. He is 31 years old, and he has his mother's eyes and his father's stubbornness. And on that morning, he looked young in a way he hadn't looked in years, not naive. Exactly, but cleaned out, like someone who'd carried something heavy for a long time and had just set it down, not because the road ahead was easy, but because they finally understood what they'd been carrying. He asked me what he should do. I told him the first thing was to call Renata. I told him she was good, and she knew the situation. I told him not to respond to any messages from Simone or Marcus, or anyone connected to them until he'd spoken to her. He said, "You already called her, didn't you?" I said I'd mentioned his name, yes, and that she was expecting his call. He laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh, but it was a real one. Renata helped Owen through the process. There was no marriage to dissolve. Legally, the ceremony had taken place, but the paperwork had not yet been filed. That was a detail of timing that worked in his favor. There was no joint account. The property transfer had never happened. The email chain was documented and preserved. Bernard's findings were handed to a lawyer who determined there was enough to warrant filing a civil claim of Owen's own. Whether that claim will go anywhere, I honestly don't know. The law moves slowly and expensively, and without any interest in narrative satisfaction. But the claim is filed. The record exists. Douglas Price's record exists. At some point, the pattern becomes difficult to deny. What I know is this. My son's house is still in his name. His accounts are his own. His mother's investment, the thing she worked and worried and quietly managed, even from a hospital bed, is intact. Simone left Ontario, as far as we can tell. Marcus's consulting firm dissolved within a month. Some chapters end not with a confrontation, but with an absence, a door that simply closes. A few weeks after all of this, on a Sunday afternoon, Owen drove out to Hamilton to help me re-weather strip the back door. I'd never finished the job from that September morning, 10 months earlier. We worked alongside each other for a couple of hours, not talking much, just working, And when we were done, we stood in the backyard with coffee and looked at the yard. I haven't quite gotten around to properly tending since Patricia died. He said, "She would have seen it too, you know. Mom, she would have seen it before you did." I thought about that. I said, "Maybe. But you would have needed both of us to convince you." He smiled, and it was the real one, the unpolished one, the one that shows up by accident when he isn't thinking about how he looks, and it was so much like his mother that I had to turn and look at the yard for a minute instead of him. Some things you protect loudly, with confrontation and documented evidence and hired experts and carefully timed revelations. And some things you protect quietly by simply refusing to look away for as long as it takes, no matter how long it takes. That's what parents do. At least, it's what I tried to do. Whether I did it right, whether there was a better way, a kinder way, a way that hurt less people and still arrived at the same place. I think about that. I genuinely do. I'm not 63 years old and satisfied with every decision I've ever made. But I'll tell you what I'm sure of. I'm sure that Owen went to sleep that Sunday night in a house that was his, in a life that was his, with nothing that didn't belong to him. And for now, that is enough.